Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of webcasts ahead of this year's Scottish independence referendum. In the hot seat today is Bob Servant and Braveheart actor Brian Cox. A vocal supporter of Scottish independence, he joins us from our London studio. Thanks very much for coming in and agreeing to take some of our viewers' questions. Let's go straight into it, and one that I'm sure you've heard before, but it's come from a number of people. It's about really why you should be telling us what to do when it comes to the independence referendum. Ross McCallum says, do you believe people who don't live in Scotland should be telling people who do how to vote in the referendum? And he asks, are you able to vote?
No, I'm not able to vote because I don't live in Scotland, and that's fair enough, I accept that. I grew up in Scotland, I was born in Scotland, I consider myself Scots. I still have a lot of connections with Scotland. I'm rector of Dundee University, and I'm the first native rector of Dundee University, i.e. city-born Dundonian. I'm very proud of my city, and I have certain views on it. Is your phrase, tell us what to vote for?
Yeah, Ross McCallum says, those who don't live in Scotland should be telling people what to do and how to vote in the referendum. It's the same sort of question that Colin Muir asks when he says, it's marvellous that you have so much to say about the independent Scotland when you have little interest in living here, he says.
Well, that's not altogether true, because I do spend a lot of time in Scotland. In fact, I spend probably at least 40% of my time in Scotland. You know, I don't actually have official residence, but I spend a lot of time. I spend a lot of money on hotels, for a start. Sure. I've got family there. So I do spend a lot of time in Scotland. And it's by spending time in Scotland I get to see Scotland. I wouldn't tell anybody what to do. I would advise what I felt was right for the country, because I think I've got enough experience in the fact that I lived in the country. You know, I grew up here. I was educated in Scotland. I've been, you know, I'm in my 60s now, so I've kind of a sense of the history of Scotland. And I also want to make it clear that I'm an independence man. I'm not a Scottish nationalist.
Sure. Well, we'll maybe get on to the sort of Scotland you would like to see. But just on the subject of voting, and you say you don't have a vote, James Mertens writes to say, as a fellow Scot, I support independence for Scotland, but cannot vote because I live in the Netherlands. Do you believe that's right? And Stephen Daniels also says he lives in the United States, and he thinks that he should have a vote, although he was born in Scotland. Do you feel that perhaps people like him and people like yourself should have a vote, notwithstanding you don't live here?
I think it's fair that if the people don't live there, I think it's probably fair that they don't have a vote. And I think that's just. I think, you know, it's circumstance. It means, you know, the Scots are great nomads. They wander all over the world. That's the history of Scotland. That's what they've done for centuries. They've not always worked, and, you know, they've been great engineers, people who've travelled. And travel is a great theme in Scotland, and certainly for Scots, the famous Scots travelled all over the world. All the kind of inventors, Alexander Graham Bell, you know, I mean, John Logie Baird, I mean, these were all Scots, but they all worked elsewhere, but their heritage and their cultural heritage, and it's my cultural heritage which is as important to me as anything else. So, on the one hand, I feel that I've got something to offer about Scotland, but at the same time I accept the fact that as I don't live in the country, I accept the fact that, yeah, that I don't have a vote. Well, what about I would like to somehow end my days in Scotland, though. That would be my desire.
Okay. What about the arguments you would use then? Because Graham Hatton says, if you were approached by an undecided voter who wanted the main reasons why they should vote yes, what would you tell them?
Well, I would say new beginnings. I would say, you know, you have to look at. I came round to the notion of Scottish independence really quite late on. I was not for it. About, you know, if you talk to me and say 20 years ago, I would have not been for it at all. But I've come to realise that we have offered so much culturally, and also my view on Scotland is actually about my view about the United Kingdom, and how, for my money, the United Kingdom doesn't function properly, it doesn't work, and how subsequent governments have been compromised in terms of their social desires, the desires in relationship to education, relationship to business in relationship to the National Health Service. One of the great governments was the Attlee government immediately after the Second World War. And Scotland, when I was a little boy, was sort of North Britain. It was not, it's only grown up as a country, but that's only in the last 50 years. But that's because of so much interruption in terms of the First World War and the Second World War. The 20th century was a history of interruptions. And then finally, at the end of the Second World War, we got the Attlee government in, which was a Labour government, and made the advances that it did in terms of the National Health Service, the mines, you know, all those elements that Mrs. Thatcher kind of dismantled eventually. And, you know, we're a small community. And also, we're a community, we were a country, the United Kingdom was a country of empire, but we're no longer a country of empire.
Yeah, you say the United Kingdom doesn't work, but you've also said, haven't you, that there should be perhaps a United States of Britain, a sort of federalism. Is that what you really believe, federalism rather than independence?
Absolutely. Well, I don't, you know, I would accept federalism. I would prefer independence, but I would accept federalism. Because I think that really, you know, I've lived in London for many, many years. I live in America, but I lived in London for many, many years. And there's no, you know, London is not the same as England. England is very different. London's almost a principality in itself. And one of the problems that's happened over the years is the fact that the government is based in London. Parliament is based in London. And I don't think Parliament should be based in London. I think Parliament should be based in somewhere like Wolverhampton or one of the Midland towns, you know, like what happens in Canada, Ottawa, Washington.
But of course, if there were an independent Scotland, it wouldn't matter to you or to us in an independent Scotland where the UK Parliament was. Let me ask you a question from...
Well, let me tell you, it doesn't matter because it's all connected. You see, it's not, you can't just, you know, if you're going to really, I mean, this is the time that one needs to talk about this thing, because they are connected in terms of how the structure affects what we inherited, you know, what our inheritance is, what the Scottish inheritance is, what we lost, and also what we've gained along the way. And interesting things, we've gained in tremendous culture. We got devolution. We didn't get it first time, we did get it second time round. It was a matter of course. And I think that the independence thing is also a kind of, it's almost organically happened to this point, where people are saying, well, the next step is to redefine ourselves, particularly in relationship to our education, you know, which is still...
So is your argument that as each tide washes up the beach, it gets higher, and that devolution didn't happen the first time, happened the second time, and so do you think that in the independence vote it may not happen this time, but there may be another one?
Very easily, yes, very easily.
Okay, let me ask you a question from Andrew Armstrong, who says, why do you believe self-determination is so important for Scotland? And there's also a hint at the campaign launch where you said that Scotland had earned the right to control its own destiny. What do you mean by earned the right?
Well, I think that you know, there's been so much taken for granted in relationship to how these islands operate. And I think Scotland certainly has shown itself as an independent spirit. It always has had an independent spirit. But as I say, 2 world wars in 1914, 1918, 1939 and 45 interrupted a lot of stuff. You know, though the fact is that we actually contributed, Scotland contributed the first big social movement of political social movement in the 1920s, when we sent the first major, through the Independent Labour Party, major MPs to Scotland from the Glasgow area, Maxton and people like that, Kirkwood, Amani, Shinwell, all that lot. And that was an amazing contribution. So over the years, we've done it by gradualism. And we've earned it because I think it's our right. I mean, I think maybe earning isn't the right phrase. I think it's our right to be independent.
Well, Peter Stevens says, you say that we've earned the right to determine our own destiny. How do you balance that with the fact that no such right has been given to England, Northern Ireland or Wales? Why do Scots people deserve special treatment from the UK?
But I equally think that they deserve the right as well. You see, we've moved into this area of globalization. We talk about the big picture, but we've lost sense of the particular. Now, the great thing about the Scandinavian countries, and it's a very good module for Scotland, and I think I watched a program on that the other night, I thought it was an excellent module, particularly in relationship to education, is the Scandinavian module deals with the particular, deals with the specific. And we are so busy trying to be big, we're so busy trying to make ourselves bigger than we are, and we forget about dealing with the particular. And that's what the wonderful opportunity is about an independent Scotland and an independent England.
Okay, what about this?
Because believe you me, if we do get independence, everything else has to be rethought in relationship to these islands.
Well,
big time.
George Anderson asks a question about the rest of the UK. He says, if Scotland decides to become an independent country, do you think the remaining UK would be the poorer for that decision? And if so, why?
Well, I think what's happened now, and certainly we're so London-centric. I mean, London, you cannot think of London as being part of England. London is its own principality, and has been for centuries, and even more so in this, since the Second World War. And it doesn't reflect what's going on in the rest of England. And the rest of England sometimes has become the poor relation to the south. And there's always been this big north-south divide. Now, the one thing that an independent Scotland throws up is what happens to England. And England has to redefine itself to England's advantage. Because when I visit, when I work, and I work all the time throughout this country, work in Liverpool, work in Manchester, you find these cities which are, Manchester's in a very good situation, Liverpool's in a less good situation. But there's always been this north-south divide. And so you see where certain communities have suffered as a result.
But you've seen globalisation as well, haven't you? Globalisation means that London is a global city. It's almost the new Rome of the world. So people come there and go from there all the time.
Right, but
maybe it's too big to have much of an impact on the rest of England. I mean, in the sense that England can't change it.
No, England can't change it. But then but London is separate, and perhaps it should be separate. Perhaps it should be its own principality. Perhaps it should be its own dominion, as it were, or own federal state.
Okay, let me ask you.
That's why federalism is a much better solution.
Okay, let me
because federalism deals with the particular.
I'll ask you a couple of questions about the arts now, because a number of people have asked about your career and about acting and the arts. Hazel Morrison says, how do you see the arts benefiting under an independent Scotland? Would independence help boost the Scottish film industry, she says?
Well, yes, I think it would, because I think that there's a lot of, there's some very good papers being worked on at the moment about how we can create a, there's two sides to a Scottish film industry. There are films which are Scottish in nature, but there's also servicing movies generally, i.e. how people like Prague service American movies, Bucharest, all these countries which have got tremendous sort of tax breaks and are much cheaper. And I think with our, with proper tax breaks, the proper tax situation, we can actually have a very fine, very good film industry. We've had hits at it occasionally, with Braveheart. And the reason we lost Braveheart, because we did lose Braveheart to Northern Ireland, not to Northern Ireland, to Southern Ireland, to Ireland, because we didn't have the tax.
Isn't there a danger that smaller countries who are chasing big budget movies compete in a race to the bottom, where you're actually almost giving it away? You're not making much money from it.
Well, that's what you have to be careful of. I mean, I think this is what's happened. I do think that there is that example of it being given away, but I think there are measures that can be put in place that doesn't happen. But we've got great craftsmen in Scotland. We've got great film craftsmen, and we service movies very, very well. And actually, people, last year they shot 2 movies in Glasgow. World War Z. And there's still, that looked like early Philadelphia, and sometimes, Glasgow looks like San Francisco. It's quite interesting.
Or New York, sometimes people say.
Or in New York,
But people talk about a critical mass being necessary. Has the Scottish film industry got to that critical mass where there are enough people with enough talent to make the rest of the world come to Scotland?
There's a lot of people with that talent, and these movements have come up before, and they've stopped because of the lack of final initiative. But I think the possibility is enormous. I think, there's also this myth about Scotland that, the weather is difficult. It's difficult to shoot. Well, on the west coast of Scotland, it is slightly difficult because of the highlands, because of the mountain mass. There is quite a lot of major cloud cover. But as soon as you get across the Cairngorms, the weather changes, and there's much more light.
Yeah, particularly Dundee, I was thinking you were going to say, or Broughty Ferry.
Well, Dundee or Broughty Ferry, but what I was thinking of Perth, because we actually ended up shooting a lot of Rob Roy in Perth and the Tayside area. Shooting those films, Rob Roy and Braveheart, did that change your opinion of the country or of
the politics of Scotland?
Well, it made me think of what was possible. This is a gradual process in my life of really, seeing the kind of extraordinary things, particularly in the Scottish universities. What Scottish universities do and how cutting edge they are. I'm very proud of my university, which is Dundee, and the stuff we do in life sciences, for example. Just across the board, the School of Computer Studies. And there is something very conducive about the kind of energy, particularly in Dundee, of how we create, how creative we can be.
All right, let me ask,
and it has a very particular Scottish energy.
Okay, I want to ask a couple of questions also about the arts, but about theatre, because Susan Palmer asks, theatre is close to your heart. Will that be affected by independence? And Sharon Moody also says, what chance of the establishment of a kind of West End for Scotland, in the sense that there is that in London, a sort of commercial theatre?
Well, it's, again, early days. I'm sure there's a possibility of it. But the actual Scottish National Theatre has done incredibly well and what I loved, what made me very proud, was the Scottish National Theatre broke the modules of theatres, because it made its premiere in 40 different spaces on the same night. So it wasn't just, so it really brought new ideas of how we do theatre. And Scotland has been very cutting edge in terms of theatre. We haven't always had the money. I think it's tragic that, for instance, we no longer have a drama school on the east coast of Scotland. We've got the Royal Conservatoire in the west coast, but we lost Queen Margaret in Edinburgh, which I think was a great tragedy.
And in terms of your own career,
we were just actually getting up there.
Do you actively seek out work in Scotland?
I have, actually, in the last couple of years, yeah. I did 4 documentaries about, I did the one about smoking, the one about sugar, which is a particular interest in me, and the whole sugar, the obesity in Scotland, the health of Scotland is also something that
And of course you're the voice of Dougie Doug in the independence
I am the voice
debate.
of Dougie Doug, but I also did we also did a thing on whiskey, we did stuff on opium. We saw the Scots' contribution to the Opium Wars, which isn't a particularly proud contribution. The Scots' contribution to slavery isn't a particularly proud contribution either. But it's a fact, it's a historical fact, that's what we did. Glasgow was built on that, and but it's really interesting. And to me, I've really got into my country's history, both the good and the bad.
Well, you mentioned earlier on that you're in your 60s, and perhaps just finally, I think you're 67 now, aren't you? When many people are thinking of retirement, do you fancy retiring to the Highlands or somewhere in Scotland?
Probably the East Coast, probably Fife would be my place of choice.
But still always up for a bit of work?
Always up for it. I'm a nomad, I think the great thing about the Scot is essentially they're kind of nomadic. We like our own, we do love our own home, we do like the home. And I have a tremendous, as I get older, I love coming home to Scotland. When I was a wee boy, I used to look at the Tay and think, oh, I can't wait to cross it. No, it's the opposite. I look at the Tay from the other side and I say, I can't wait to get home. Well, so I love it.
We'll maybe go into little pubs in the East Nuke of Fife and see you in the corner somewhere.
Absolutely.
Okay. Brian Cox,
chance of it.
Thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And thank you very much. For more on the independence debate, including background, analysis and the latest developments in this story, go to the BBC Scotland News website and click on Scotland's Future. Bye-bye.